Oh, blah, 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 blah. Anybody else? Blah. Okay. I was going to go live, but instead I just grinded out 8 hours of my factory, okay? What's going on today? See, Site Guy privated his video on H3H3. I did indeed, which is probably good, right? Hassan is obsessing over you? Yeah, because he's my #1 fan. Duh.
So what happened? Did he watch like Destiny's reaction to the content cop and then tried to do a shitty version of it? He sounds like Destiny's orbiters that come in here and try to argue and use the similar the similar talking points and the same speech patterns. Like, buddy.
Are there any updates on the court stuff? Nope. All just takes time, and they love. The other side loves wasting time right now, so.
Anyway,
guys.
So what happened? Did he watch?
Wow, good. Nice clip. Isn't there a counter legal thing you can do to hold them accountable for taking too long? Well, not taking too long. The court process is just, it's a long time.
Is that you?
Destiny.
Why do you hate me so much? I didn't always. I was obsessed with you. For so long, I wanted to be the
Destiny.
I spent years figuring out how you came to be. Duplicated the
debate tactics.
And it worked. I became like you. So what happened? This ability
Just to fucking mold me.
revealed the truth. My fate was to become your greatest enemy. I was never going to be the
Destiny.
So I became the reverse of everything that you were. The more people you saved, the more you were loved, the more I had to take from you. That is why you
Talk to a black person like Trihex and say, hey, the N-word, it's always bad, brother.
That's so dumb.
Because you couldn't be me, I became you. I am the one thing you cannot stop. No, not anymore. Our race is over. And you lost. I've learned,
Argumentative tactics that you apply to the right.
and one day soon, I'll learn.
Ground moral axioms.
Rip Rem. Back in the day.
In the wake of Trump's Liberation Day tariff announcement, we saw US stocks, bonds, and the dollar all fall at once, in what many interpreted as a broad shift away from investing in America. When the stock market falls and volatility explodes like it did last week, you'd expect Treasury yields to fall as investors rush to safety and buy Treasury bonds. That didn't happen this time around. Investors were instead selling Treasuries, and their yields were spiking higher. When you see Treasury yields rise like this, you'd normally expect the dollar to rise, as the higher interest rate should attract investors. That didn't happen this time either. As Robert Armstrong described it in the the dollar to rise. As the higher Treasury yields rise like this, you'd normally expect the dollar to rise, as the higher interest rate should attract investors. That didn't happen this time either. As Robert Armstrong described it in the FT, was the spike in U.S. Treasury. We saw, as they think, a moment when high deficits either. As Robert Armstrong described it in the FT, the U.S. policymakers had been unpredictable and incompetent at a moment when high deficits and lingering inflation worries mean that there's no room for amateurism. As The Economist said, if investors are fleeing even though bond returns are up, it must be because they think America has become more risky. They went on to say that rumors are rife that big foreign asset managers are dumping greenbacks. These wild swings in the bond market and the fall in the dollar by most accounts caused Trump to announce a 90-day pause on tariffs.
Well, I thought that people were jumping a little bit out of line. They were getting yippy, you know? They were getting a little bit yippy, a little bit afraid, unlike these champions.
During the market chaos, we saw other safe haven markets rise as money moved into German, Japanese, and Swiss government bonds, along with gold. The head of foreign exchange research at Deutsche Bank wrote in a note that the market is reassessing the structural attractiveness of the dollar as the world's global reserve currency and is undergoing a process of rapid de-dollarization. Many compared the sell-off in US assets to the British market turmoil in 2022, when Liz Truss announced sweeping tax cuts that she said she would pay for with massive government borrowing. Larry Summers, the former US Treasury Secretary, wrote on Twitter that the broader sell-off suggested a generalized aversion to US assets in global financial markets. And he went on to say that we're being treated by global financial markets like a problematic emerging market. Ray Dalio, the hedge fund manager, who has been warning for the last 3 years that the US could lose its reserve currency status, said that we're seeing a classic breakdown of the major monetary, political, and geopolitical orders. He said, when you reach the part of the cycle that you have to borrow money to pay debt service, and the holders of those bonds say it's a risky situation, in the private debt market, we call that the debt spiral.
Remember, ordinarily, people can talk about U.S. debt, or they can talk about the deficit, or they can talk about our interest payments or whatever. But the reality is that the U.S. can always issue more debt, or could always issue more debt, and we'll probably always have people to buy it because it's the fucking U.S. economy. Like, who's going to bet against the U.S. economy? So it's just always a safe place to store your money. When that assumption is no longer true, the way that you analyze how the United States can, I think, engage with their debt and engage with their budget changes, I think, significantly. It was pretty spooky.
In one of his YouTube videos from 3 years ago, Dalio describes how he has studied the 10 most powerful empires over the last 500 years, along with the last 3 reserve currencies, and how global leadership changes. He says in the video that he has found that there are 250-year economic cycles where empires rise and fall. He argued back then that we're living through a change in world leadership today, and the question isn't if we're in the middle of a changing world order, it's how deep in we are and what can we do to prevent this change before it's too late. The most worrying market event of the last few weeks was the spike in US Treasury yields and the correlation that was seen between stocks, bonds, and market volatility. While markets have since calmed down, investors are still concerned that foreign buyers are stepping away from US Treasuries and now wonder if it's wise to apply a risk premium to US assets. Some have even suggested that China might have been dumping US Treasuries last week to put Trump under pressure to what.
It's important to make sure not to push the idea that no one is buying the debt, because most of chat is fucking retarded and would view that as default. The reality is less people want to buy your debt, so the cost of it goes up. Yeah, but I mean, like, it's the same thing, really, right? Like, nobody is... The issue would never be that nobody is going to buy the debt, right? The issue is going to be that interest becomes so high on what you have to offer for anybody to buy it that it basically collapses, right? It's a little bit... I don't know if I'd say circular, but... Not circular. It's just like a thing. Like, you're never going to run out of oil, for instance. The planet will never run out of oil because the last barrel of oil would be like $1 billion, right? It'll just become prohibitively expensive and then people won't use fossil fuel anymore.
Walk back his tower.
Or we'll all die.
So is Ray Dalio right? Should we be concerned about the US dollar losing its reserve currency status? Before we dig into that, let me tell you about this week's video sponsor, Cove Pure, who sent me their new CP16 water filtration system to try out.
Damn.
The CP16 sits on your countertop and requires no plumbing. The 2 filters eliminate up to 99% of contaminants, including heavy metals, microplastics, forever chemicals, and arsenic. Obviously, you don't want any of that in your water.
You don't know.
It comes with a built-in water jug that you can bring to the table during meal times. I drink a lot of tea and coffee, and if you go to a good coffee shop, you'll notice that they have big water filtration systems, as filtered water improves the taste, but also reduces the maintenance needed for their coffee machines. The Cove Pure filter provides instant hot or cold water, and you can set the temperature you want it to be. If you drink green tea, you ruin the flavor by using boiling water. You're supposed to use 80 to 85 degree water, which is hard to get right with a kettle, but it's easy with the Cove Pure. I like this so much that I'm planning on getting a second one for my office. Go to covepure.com/Patrick or click on the link in the description to get $200 off the Cove Pure. Ray Dalio told CNBC last week that he's concerned about trade disruptions, mounting US debt, and emerging world powers bringing down the international economic and geopolitical structure that's been in place since the end of World War II. He said that while Trump's tariffs have understandable goals, they're being implemented in a very disruptive way that creates global conflict. He called for a trade agreement with China and said that Congress should reduce the federal deficit to 3% of GDP, saying that the very value of money is at stake. While I agree with Dalio that the trade chaos that we have seen in recent weeks is bad for the United States, and I worry that other unconventional ideas that some of Trump's economic advisors have been discussing, like Stephen Moran's Mar-a-Lago Accord, are extremely worrying, I don't agree that the dollar will lose reserve currency status anytime soon, simply because there's no reasonable alternative to the dollar right now. If you're interested, I'll discuss Moran's Mar-a-Lago Accord towards the end of the video. The US dollar first took on reserve currency status in 1944, as World War II was drawing to a close. That year, representatives from 44 nations met at a hotel in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, to hammer out a new financial system for the global economy. Out of Bretton Woods came the World Bank, the IMF, and most importantly, a new role for the dollar as the international reserve currency. At the time, Europe was in rubble. The formerly world-leading economies were destroyed, and the United States controlled most of the world's gold. The US agreed to fix the value of the dollar to gold at $35 an ounce, and other countries then fixed their exchange rates to the dollar, making the dollar the central cog in the overall system. In 1971, Richard Nixon suspended the convertibility of the dollar into gold, and the fixed exchange rate system became a floating exchange rate system, but the dollar still remained at the center of it as the international reserve currency. The dollar's special role has long irritated politicians from other countries, and the French finance minister in 1960 famously complained about America's exorbitant privilege, as the US could print paper to buy physical goods from its trade partners. Other countries, he argued, had to create goods to earn currency. In 2022, when Russia invaded Ukraine, the United States was able to sanction Russia, freeze their dollar reserves, and cut them off from the global financial system. A number of world leaders expressed concern at the time that the United States could weaponize the dollar and access to the global financial system. At the time, this wasn't a huge concern for most countries, as they didn't envision a world in which they were at odds with the United States. Most international leaders felt that if you weren't planning on a war of aggression, there was no reason to worry about the weaponization of the dollar. That's how the thinking went at the time, anyhow. US government debt has long been the preferred place for central banks around the world to store their reserves, because of the size and strength of the country, the safety and tradability of its debt, and the dominant role of the dollar in international trade and finance, and of course, the rule of law. As the FT pointed out this week, to highlight the global importance of the dollar, while the US only accounts for a quarter of the global economy, more than 57% of the world's foreign exchange reserves are held in dollars. About 60% of all international loans and deposits are denominated in dollars, and 70% of international bond issuance is too. In foreign exchange, 88% of all transactions cross-reference the dollar, as while there may not be a liquid market between two small currencies, there will be a liquid market between each of them and the US dollar. The FT points out that
Does it? My understanding of that, why couldn't the euro be the reserve currency? The euro is, I think, relatively newish. How old is the euro? Yeah, the euro is about 26 years old. Fuck, I was just saying something. Now you fucked my brain.
between each of them and
Oh. If your economy is not very stable, or if your currency is not very stable, it makes somebody not really want to trade in your currency because, like if I market something in Somalian dollars and then I'm trying to trade with somebody in Uganda and our currencies are fluctuating, you know, maybe even day to day or month to month or whatever, it's just hard to create a market where you can buy and sell things at a predictable cost, right? In like the obvious world, you would say that this creates a lot of unpredictability, and so then it's hard to just do business, period. But then in ways that maybe is a little bit harder to see, it's also difficult because sometimes, you know, you might have shipped goods that are already on the way to a destination and the price might change on the way there or something, right? So this is why when people say that trades are denominated in USD, it's easy to just say, okay, I'm going to buy and sell. I'm not going to list this price in my currency. I'm going to list it in United States dollars. And then you can use that as kind of like a go-between currency anytime you're doing trades because it guarantees some level of stability, price stability, basically, as far as being pegged to a particular currency with some stability.
the US dollar. The FT points out that even physical US banknotes are widely held abroad, where about half of all US banknotes in issue are held by foreigners. The euro is the principal alternative. And
if Dems get back into power, do you think the cat is kind of out of the bag on American hegemony as other countries don't trust us anymore? Yeah, the problem is that now every single country on the planet is going to be looking at the United States like fucking petrified that, you know, we're going to hit a recession or something because they know that if America runs into any trouble, they're going to be putting in, you know, economic Hitler again. And that's just, it just doesn't feel good to be in a relationship of any kind with that sort of person. It damages our credibility a ton. And it also hurts that, I don't know how to explain this. It's a very frustrating feeling. It's a very violent feeling. It makes me very angry that when Democrats and the rest of the world are kind of like stressed out on like, okay, well, what are we going to do to, you know, stabilize U.S. opinion around the world, or what the fuck, like what are we doing? The Republicans are just kind of like chugging along. They don't give a fuck. Like the Republicans don't care. Republicans on my chat don't care. Republicans on Twitter don't care. It seems like the Republican lawmakers, like nobody actually gives a fuck. So it's that League of Legends situation that I said, where you kind of, you're like, half of your country is like trying very, very hard to stabilize and bail the country. And the other half is like just gleefully inting. And it's just kind of like a big joke, a big meme. And it's just a very, very difficult situation to work in. Like the other side doesn't even give a fuck that they're literally destroying the United States' place on the planet because they live in a totally different reality than the rest of the world does. So,
are held by foreigners. The euro is the principal alternative, and it makes up 20% of central bank reserves. After that comes the Japanese yen and the British pound. In the past, foreign-owned U.S. Treasury bonds were seen.
The U.S. dollar became the world reserve currency after World War II in 1944. The euro didn't start existing until 99, so that's probably the explanation. Well, no, I'm explaining why even today it probably wouldn't be the euro. Also, the euro is the USD is the United States currency. In the United States is 50 states that aren't going anywhere. For the euro, I mean, imagine how scary it would be if the euro was your currency and then like Brexit happens. Waiting 5 seconds for some retarded chat to very quickly spam that the United Kingdom wasn't using the euro. I'm aware of that. But there's a lot of stability questioning sometimes for the European Union. And that same stability question doesn't exist for, or didn't exist for, the United States, right? Like, the European Union could theoretically still dissolve. Nobody really thought that that could happen to the U.S. I doubt the U.S. will resolve, but yeah.
Seen in the U.S. as a source of geopolitical leverage. Hillary Clinton, the then Secretary of State, famously asked in 2009 when talking about China, how do you deal toughly with your banker? This way of thinking has changed significantly in recent years, where owners of US assets now instead worry about upsetting the country that holds so much of their central bank reserves. So why do foreign countries own so many dollars? Well, as the economist Michael Pettis frequently points out, if a foreign country runs a current account surplus, exporting more than they import, they accumulate the currency and thus the bonds of the country with the largest current account deficit. The deficit country, which is importing more than it exports, has to borrow money to do this, and it borrows money by issuing bonds. Their bonds are going to be the most available to invest in, and thus that's where the money goes. Central banks keep their reserves in US dollars, euros, yen, and pounds for one very simple reason. Only those economies and financial systems are large enough, open enough, and flexible enough, and trustworthy enough to accommodate large trade deficits. But the badge of honor associated with being a reserve currency does come at the cost of a nation's ability to manage its debt levels. If other countries are going to buy your currency, you can either let your currency rise in value or issue additional bonds to stabilize the exchange rate. China, which is a huge economy, couldn't replace the dollar in the global financial system with its currency without opening its capital account and allowing the free movement of currency in and out of its economy, which it's unwilling to do. Countries like China that run a trade surplus could in theory invest their reserves in other large global economies like Europe and Japan. But these economies also run persistent surpluses, and instead of issuing a lot of bonds, are net acquirers of foreign assets too. If China were to move from US dollar reserves to euro reserves, the ECB would either have to tolerate an appreciation in the value of the euro, or it would have to buy other foreign assets, which means American assets, to neutralize the net impact of the Chinese inflows.
You can't get rid, if you're the rest of the world, you can't get rid of dollars. I mean, if you're sitting in Japan, China, or someplace, and you own a lot of U.S. government bonds, if you sell them to somebody in the United States, you get U.S. dollars. So you still have U.S. assets. If you sell them to somebody in France, you've now got euros, but they've got the government bonds. You can't get rid of those assets, but you can't have people trying to head for the door very quickly with them under certain circumstances.
Daniel McDowell from Syracuse University has pointed out that in the past, central banks only aimed to hold enough foreign exchange reserves to cover about 3 months of their country's imports or all of their short-term debts. Reserves from this perspective were seen as a rainy day fund to make sure an economy can still trade and avoid default in times of crisis. Other than that, foreign exchange was earned so that foreign-made goods could be purchased. Over the last 20 years or so, central banks around the world have been growing their reserves well beyond this point. And once reserves get larger, as has been happening, central bankers begin to think of them as a portfolio, where they want safe, liquid investments, and they try to hold a diverse portfolio that optimizes and stabilizes returns over time. Brad Setzer of the Council on Foreign Relations points out that as China's reserves grew, they began to first shift their dollar portfolio from US treasuries towards agencies and then equities, basically taking a bit more risk in what's effectively an investment portfolio. Setzer's research shows that China began reducing the dollar share of foreign reserves starting in around 2005, and that their diversification out of the dollar was more or less complete by 2011 or 2012. The Belt and Road Initiative, he points out, was a way for China to diversify their reserves into physical assets around the world. The big idea here is that reserve currencies don't quickly come and go. It instead takes decades for a country to gain or lose reserve currency status,
theoretically,
not weeks or months. The United States became the leading economic power in the world in the 1870s.
It's my birthday today, man. Turned 30. Wanted to show my support. Can I get a shout out from my favorite streamer? Watch you every day. No.
The United States became the leading economic power in the world in the 1870s, but didn't have the reserve currency until around...
Just kidding, bro. Happy birthday, Ram.
70 years later. And this only happened when other major economies were destroyed by war. London's role as a major financial centre remains 80 years after the pound lost its reserve currency status, as London continued to be a centre of financial expertise. There has been some press over the last week pointing to China's stockpile of treasuries as a lever that they could use to pressure Trump with. Some people wondered if Chinese selling caused the bond market chaos that we saw last week, which caused Trump to blink. China is the number 2 holder of treasury bonds, coming in right after Japan, and they own $759 billion worth of US debt. We can't quickly work out who was selling bonds last week or why, as there's no real-time data available, but if China decided to do that, they would be harming the value of their investments in order to hurt the United States, which may not make a lot of sense.
Not based.
Chinese treasury holdings have been steadily falling to the lowest level since 2011, according to the US Department of the Treasury. But it's not easy to know their exact holdings. Brad Setzer points out that some of China's foreign asset holdings show up in the Chinese state-owned banks. Additionally, holdings listed as belonging to countries like Belgium are seen as being linked to custodian accounts in China, and these have been growing too. It's quite possible that China and other international investors might not be actively selling US assets, but they may be nervous about buying any more. And a big buyer who walks away will also have an impact on markets.
Oh, that's true. I didn't even think of that. And that's a thing that I always mention, that sometimes it's not about things going up or down. Sometimes it's about things going up slower than they were before, down slower than they were before. People dumping treasuries wouldn't be the only thing that could theoretically drive up bond yields. It could also be that there was a steady influx of buyers who are no longer buying, and that could push bond yields up as well. I never considered that, I guess.
Markets, the lower demand will show up in the pricing too. US outperformance in recent years has been a bet on US exceptionalism. Investors bet on America's cutting-edge industries, its unrivaled universities, the rule of law, and a pro-business culture. US outperformance in recent years has been a bet on US exceptionalism. Investors bet on America's cutting-edge industries, its unrivaled universities, the rule of law, and a pro-business culture. Janan Ganesh wrote back in January that unlike other countries, the United States never had a specific growth strategy. But whenever growth bumped up against another imperative, the American bias was to choose growth. Ganesh points out that other countries will claim that growth is a priority, but then add an additional priority, which is the one they really care about. The US was different, he said, as whenever growth came into conflict with another priority, for Americans, growth always prevailed. Robin Wigglesworth wrote this week that whether by accident or design, almost every action taken by the US government over the last 3 months has hurt the dollar. The dollar index, which measures the strength of the dollar against a basket of its biggest peers, fell 2.8% last week alone, and is down almost 9% since its peak in early January. The dollar smile theory is an idea first observed about 20 years ago by Stephen Jen, and it refers to the way that the US dollar typically underperforms other currencies.
This is real.
When global growth is moderate, but outperforms when either the US is booming or during times of market stress. In panicked markets, according to the theory, people want to be in dollars for safety, regardless of the state of the US economy. This was clear during the global financial crisis when the dollar rose, and again during...
Fuck, there are so many ways that, like, I'd never even considered this aspect to, like, our currency or this aspect to our deficit before. It's kind of weird, I guess, how things work out. But I guess, like, the United States truly was, like a safe harbor for all economic instability. And we benefited hardcore from that as well. The entire world would flee to US dollars anytime, you know, people weren't sure what was going on. And then that allowed us in the same times of economic instability to run a decently big budget deficit at much, much, much less cost than it would be ordinarily.
during the COVID panic in 2020 as investors rushed to the dollar for safety. Reuters point out that so far in 2025, the dollar has failed to respond positively to market stress, suggesting that a profound shift in investor behavior may be afoot. The worry now is that the Trump administration's apparent willingness to upend norms means that previously unthinkable things are now possible. In such a scenario, the dollar can no longer be viewed as a safe haven. Katie Martin wrote in the FT this week that US stocks carry political risk for the first time. Its bonds no longer act like they're truly risk-free. The dollar's not acting like a magnet.
So one really scary implication here, and it sucks because this stuff is going to show up like in the form of kind of weird embedded financial problems later on. I guess one really scary aspect to how this works is that the next time the United States runs into any kind of major financial crisis where we do have to print currency, so a thing like COVID, major financial crisis. I feel like I've lived through 3 of these in my lifetime now. 4. Do I get to count the dot-com bubble if I was 12? Because we had 2007, we had COVID, and then we had, well, I guess maybe just those 2 or 3 for the dot-com bubble. I don't know if 2022 counts. The borrowing might get way, 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 way more expensive next time because now we don't have anybody else who's willing to fund U.S. debt in the same way they would before, because now we've literally explicitly made an enemy out of all of those countries economically.
During periods of stress, nor like a currency. And
the post 9/11 recession was pretty bad too, right? I don't think it was, but I was also pretty young. If it was, I don't remember. I know there was a bit of a shock to the markets, but I don't think so. Can you imagine what happens when Trump installs a new loyalist for the Fed chair who will lower the interest rates just because Trump wants it? If Trump, like, I say this, but we've crossed this line like 10 times. If Trump would install a loyalist in the Fed chair, that should be like a coup moment. But like cooing over financial stuff, that should be the coup moment. Like that's just, it would be the end in a way that might be impossible to come back from. But
anticipating an upswing in American economic growth. Last June, before taking on his current role at the Treasury, Scott Bessent criticized his predecessor, Janet Yellen, for issuing a lot of short-term treasuries and reducing the supply of longer-term treasuries. He described this as stealth quantitative easing, saying that it was being used to stimulate markets in the lead-up to the election. Bessent claimed that he would reverse this, but has instead doubled down.
Oh, and I just... Wait. Okay, hold on. Fuck. Okay, so now that I understand a little bit... Well, never mind, actually. I'm gonna watch a quick video. Oh, the guy. Hold on. I always trust these guys.
Did you hear about the Fed?
No, what about the Fed?
They announced another round of the quantitative easing.
What does that mean?
It means they are going to make large asset purchases via PAMO.
What does that mean?
It means they are going to expand their balance sheet and buy treasuries.
What does that mean?
It means they are going to print a ton of money.
So why do they call it the quantitative easing? Why don't they just call it the printing money?
Because the printing money is the last refuge of failed economic empires and banana republics.
Okay, never mind. Let's try this one.
This video is sponsored by Skillshare. Go to skl.sh/theplanebagel5 to get a free 2-month premium trial. Quantitative easing is something we've seen pop up around the world ever since the 2008 financial crisis. The US, UK, Eurozone, and Japan are just some of the countries that have implemented the unconventional monetary policy as a way of helping their economies recover from the recession. But what exactly is quantitative easing?
Well, fuck, having a better understanding, I repeat a thing a lot, and then I have like I don't really know much about QE other than it's a way to inject money into the economy somehow. That's literally the only thing I know about it, but I couldn't explain the mechanisms, but I will after this video. But it's funny because QE conflicts with something that I've said over and over and over again that I've never really considered before, which is that the Federal Reserve is not supposed to manage your economy, in the United States of America at least. I don't know if all central banking systems go by the same principle, but the Federal Reserve is here to manage unemployment and inflation, and that's it. If you whether the economy is doing good or bad or whatever, economic policy, that's supposed to be up to Congress and the president, and you work out your budgets and your economic plans, whatever, and that's that. The Federal Reserve is not supposed to be here to give you a strong and thriving economy. It's just supposed to manage those two indicators. But I guess QE, I don't know if this would have been the first time or one major time where the Federal Reserve was looking at the economy and was like, well, hold on, we're going to make the economy better, I think. But
well, the short of it is that it involves printing money, which is thought to encourage business activity. But it's a little more complicated than just creating dollar bills and tossing them from a helicopter to cheering crowds and businesses below. The central bank will use the newly created money that it produces to purchase assets from the market. And while this isn't different from what the institution actually typically does, it's the scale and the type of assets involved that makes quantitative easing so unconventional and, quite frankly, controversial. So let's go through how quantitative easing works and what it means for the economy on today's Playing Bagel.
Let's do it.
A country's central bank, like the Federal Reserve in the US and the Bank of Canada in Canada, is the steward of the country's currency. They are intended to be an independent institution from the government. And among their responsibilities is the task of actually issuing money and managing its supply, while simultaneously helping the economy maximize employment and stabilize prices. So when a country starts to show signs of a slowing economy, the central bank will typically step in to try and boost business activity through expansionary monetary policy, which involves influencing the country's currency to encourage more spending and lending. One way they do this is by changing their policy interest rates, which you hear about in the news quite a bit, especially within the last decade. By lowering interest rates they pay on their deposits that they receive from other banks, the central bank applies downward pressure to other interest rates within the economy, from interest rates paid on government bonds and corporate debts to car loans and mortgages that you or I might take out. The idea is that a lower cost of borrowing will encourage spending, which is a fair assumption. If you were going to buy a house, for example, you might be more inclined to make a current purchase if you could borrow at a lower interest rate. Whereas if interest rates were higher, you might decide to hold off and, at the very least, increase the down payment you make before making the purchase so that you don't have to borrow as much and pay the expensive interest rate that you're going to be charged. Low interest rates have prevailed in most developed countries since the 2008 financial crisis. But as you would expect, interest rates can only go down so far. In the US and Canada, the central bank interest rates are in the low single-digit range.
Are you excited on your upcoming debate with Andrew Wilson? What are your preps? It's like a religious debate, so not necessarily, but like I said, I'm getting back into the swing of things.
And in the Eurozone and several other countries around the world, rates are actually in the low negative range. And so with little to no leverage left in that department, many central banks have implemented or considered expanding quantitative easing programs, first started a decade ago, as a way to continue stimulating their economies. Quantitative easing, or QE as it's commonly referred, is the process by which the central bank injects money into the economy. But while it's often imagined as a central bank printing dollar bills and giving them to banks and corporations, it's not that simple. Firstly, the move is actually mostly digital, with the central bank simply crediting themselves electronic funds, and the money enters the economy through open market operations.
In Germany, when runaway inflation happened and things like a banana suddenly cost $1 billion, do jobs just keep raising wages to keep up? That part was confusing from the book. Yeah, I think wages just go up every single day. It becomes like really goofy. It wouldn't surprise me if they didn't mention this in the book, but I know this happened in the Soviet Union. I feel like I'm making this word up. I think in the Soviet Union, they used to have little books, and they would call them blats or bliats or something, where what you would do is, it was almost like a barter system. You would have a little card, and you would start trading favors with neighbors or whatever in order to buy and sell things like flour or whatever. You basically kind of be like on a barter system. I don't know if that's the right word or not, but
that is, the central bank inserts
blat is just Russian for clout. Okay, I don't know.
Crediting themselves electronic funds, and the money enters the economy through open market operations. That is, the central bank inserts itself into the market as a buyer and purchases securities and assets using its new money, typically buying government bills and bonds from other banks. This action increases an economy's money supply. By buying the assets, the central bank is replacing them with new money, as if pulling the funds from an alternate dimension and injecting them into the economy. The process also leads to the central bank increasing or expanding its balance sheet, since it will end up holding financial assets. So why does the central bank consider doing this? What's the benefit of buying financial assets from the market? Well, one of the main objectives of QE is to lower the costs of borrowing, i.e. they're looking to ease a country's financial markets. This is done during periods where financial markets are tight, or when banks are more reluctant to lend, like after the financial crisis when the credibility of many businesses and organizations became less certain. Now, when overnight rates are near 0% from the central bank's influence, banks already borrow at a cheap cost. But the rates they turn around and charge on other longer-term loans may still be high. So by increasing money held by the banks, which is sitting around not earning a very high return, the hope is that the banks will be more willing to lend out to businesses and consumers. And since there's more banks with more money to lend, they will ideally compete and lower interest rates, making it easier for market participants to borrow and spend. Thus,
the USSR functioned largely on international goods sold through black market transactions, which people with blat were able to acquire. Maybe, yeah. I wish I could remember. I feel like that was the name of the little book. But the, I think for a lot of command economies, because I remember reading about this in Vietnam back in the day. Well, this was before Vyvanse, so it's not the most in-depth reading. But a lot of command economies where there's like strict price controls and it's like, well, socialism and all that shit apparently rely pretty heavily on shadow markets, I think is what they would call them, not necessarily black markets. They call them shadow markets. So you'd have your command economy on top, but then like 30% of your economy would be running off the books, or at least off of any way for the government to track it, where people were buying and selling things at closer to fair market price.
Thus, theoretically, saving the economy. This is why higher money supply is thought to lead to lower interest rates. Money becomes easier to come across, so it costs less to borrow. QE can also decrease interest rates by lowering the yield on financial assets. As a quick refresher, yield is the income return in investment.
Do you actually read studies now that you're about to answer just the intro to abstract? I usually just try to read the whole study. Studies usually aren't that long. Like if you're willing to sit down, you can usually read a study in less than an hour. Unless it's like, I mean, for heavy, like for very, very heavy mathy stuff, I'm not going to be able to read too much of it. But like most scientific literature is fairly easy to read, I think. Like if you're willing to sit down and read it. I think sometimes there's I don't know how to explain this. Hold on, I'm trying to make sure I'm not saying something as a 190 IQ privileged person no, I'm just kidding. I think a lot of sitting down and reading something like scientific literature, I think a lot of it comes down to trusting yourself. And I think a lot of people don't have a lot of built-in trust that they can read something and understand it. So what happens is you read a little bit and it's kind of confusing, and then you just give up immediately, and then you're just done with it. You're like, I can't, this is too much. But like, if you've watched me read through stuff on stream, as long as you're willing to read something, and if you don't understand a word, just Google it, look it up, Wikipedia it, look it up. If you don't understand something that is explaining, just look it up. If you just do that over and over again, eventually you'll pick up the ability to read stuff, I think. Yeah. People think that it's more difficult than it actually is, I think.
Receives when they purchase an investment. It's interest or dividend payments divided by the price paid, the market price. By buying financial assets like Treasury bills, the central bank increases its price by bidding it up, thereby lowering its yield with interest rates remaining constant. This has a number of effects. For one, it can make it easier for the government to borrow money moving forward. For example, imagine the government has issued $1,000 Treasury bills that pay $20 annually, so a 2% annual interest rate. And the central bank has bid up the price of outstanding Treasury bills to $1,100, so they now only offer a yield of 1.8% to new investors. Because outstanding Treasury bills only offer a 1.8% return to investors, the government could issue future Treasury bills that pay, say, $18 annually and still offer a competitive rate, lowering their own cost of borrowing and allowing them to spend more. In this way, QE can actually help a government pursue fiscal policy, whereby the government increases spending to directly increase economic activity. Another effect of this is that it encourages more investment in riskier assets. Since government debt, which is fairly not risky, offers a less attractive return, investors may look to sell Treasury bills and bonds to purchase higher yield corporate bonds and stocks, something that can help boost the stock market and improve capital market conditions, again making it easier to borrow money. So that's why central banks might pursue QE. But what we've described isn't much different from the standard open market operations carried out by central banks. In fact, purchasing Treasury bills is one of the standard mechanisms used by the Federal Reserve for managing the federal funds rate in the US. What makes QE different is its scale and the fact that it can span other financial assets outside of government debt. In the US, for example, the Federal Reserve found itself adding almost $4 trillion to the US economy after 2008. And from
okay, I'm gonna be honest. I don't know if it's because I was trying to I have no fucking idea what the fuck you just said for any of this. I'm sorry. Hold on. We're going back.
To continue stimulating their economies. Quantitative easing, or QE as it's commonly referred, is the process by which the central bank injects money into the economy. But while it's often imagined as a central bank printing dollar bills and giving them to banks and corporations, it's not that simple. Firstly, the move is actually mostly digital, with the central bank simply crediting themselves electronic funds, and the money enters the economy through open market operations. That is, the central bank inserts itself into the market as a buyer and purchases securities and assets using its new money, typically buying government bills and bonds from other banks. This action increases an economy's money supply. By buying the assets in its new money through open market. Firstly, the move is actually but while it's often imagined as a central bank printing dollar bills and giving them to banks and corporations, it's not that simple. Firstly, the move is actually mostly digital, with the central bank simply crediting themselves electronic funds, and the money enters the economy through open market.
Oh, the Fed can do this because the Fed can create currency, right? So they can create digital currency, so they can just say, whoop, I have this much money, right? Okay, that makes sense.
Operations. That is, the central bank inserts itself into the market as a buyer and purchases securities and assets using its new money, typically buying government bills and bonds from other banks. This action increases an economy's money supply. By buying the assets, the central bank is replacing them with new money, as if pulling the funds from an alternate dimension and injecting them into the economy. The process also leads to the central bank increasing or expanding its balance sheet, since it will end up holding financial assets. So why does the central bank consider doing this? What's the benefit of buying financial assets from the market? Well, one of the main objectives of QE is to lower the costs of borrowing, i.e. they're looking to ease a country's financial markets. This is done during periods where financial markets are tight, or when banks are more reluctant to lend, like after the financial crisis when the credibility of many businesses and organizations became less certain. Now, when overnight rates are near 0% from the central bank's influence, banks already borrow at a cheap cost, but the rates they turn around and charge on other longer-term loans may still be high. So by increasing money held by the banks, which is sitting around not earning a very high return, the hope is that the banks will be more willing to lend out to businesses and consumers. And since there's more banks with more money to lend, they will ideally compete and lower interest rates, making it easier for market participants to borrow and spend, thus theoretically saving the economy.
Oh, okay, hold on, I think I understand. Okay, So I'm a bank. I own a whole bunch of, are these called cash equivalent things? So like treasury bonds. I'm holding a whole bunch of treasury bonds, but interest rates right now are very low. Okay, so interest rates are 1%, but I'm holding a bunch of these treasury bonds. What are you going to do? You can't, I mean, you could, negative interest rates is exotic. No one cares. So what the Federal Reserve does is the Federal Reserve says, hey, let's go ahead and buy those from you. We're going to buy, you've got $1 billion worth of treasury bills or whatever. We're going to buy those from you, or treasury, whatever the fuck. We're going to buy those from you. And then instead of having the treasury bond or the treasury bill, what is it called exactly? Instead of having that thing, you have cash instead. Interest rates are still very low. So if you're sitting on cash instead of those cash equivalents, you start lending that money to people, and then that's what drives the economy. That's you basically pumping liquidity into the banks by swapping out their debt that they're holding from the United States government at very low interest rates. You swap that debt out with cash, and then they lend it, basically, right?
This is why higher money supply is thought to lead to lower interest rates. Money becomes easier to come across, so it costs less to borrow. QE can also decrease interest rates by lowering the yield on financial assets. As a quick refresher, yield is the income return an investor receives when they purchase an investment. It's interest or dividend payments divided by the price paid, the market price. By buying financial assets like treasury bills, the central bank increases its price.
Under TARP, Troubled Asset Relief Fund, during the GFC, the U.S. government actually took partial ownership of multiple financial institutions and a brand of quantitative easing. Gotcha. You're basically deleting bonds from the circulation of the markets. Yes, but the bonds are then bought by the Fed, and the Fed is probably going to have to do something to pay them back in the future, right? So the Fed will have to issue more debt in the future to pay off the current money that's borrowing from itself, I guess? Or what is the... Because there has to be a drawback. They get deleted? Well, there has to be a drawback at some point. No? The Fed gives the bank credit as reserves. So if I have $10 billion in outstanding debt for treasury bonds, and I just buy that debt, and then I issue you a credit. Oh no, because I guess the Fed is the debtor. Right? And then the bank is the creditor. So if the debtor buys the credit shit, then it would be just voided, I guess. So what is, okay, so then walk me, what is the downside of this? Like, let's say theoretically right now, the Fed were to just buy all of its debt back all over the world and just credit. Oh, it would seriously drive down the value of the dollar, because now there would be way more USD in circulation, which would probably drive down the dollar. Interest rates would be insanely low to non-existent because there'd be so much money around, basically, right? That it would be tons of inflation, basically. The drawback is inflation, since you're increasing money supply. I see. Okay. I think. Okay. All right.
By bidding it up, thereby lowering its yield with interest rates remaining constant. This has a number of effects. For one, it can make it easier for the government to borrow money moving forward. For example, imagine the government has issued $1,000 treasury bills that pay $20 annually, so a 2% annual interest rate. And the central bank has bid up the price of outstanding treasury bills to $1,100. So they now only offer a yield of 1.8% to new investors. Because outstanding treasury bills only offer a 1.8% return to investors, the government could issue future treasury bills that pay, say, $18 annually and still offer a competitive rate, lowering their own cost of borrowing and allowing them to spend more. In this way, QE can actually help a government pursue fiscal policy, whereby the government increases spending to directly increase economic activity. Another effect of this is that it encourages more investment in riskier assets. Since government debt, which is fairly not risky, offers a less attractive return, investors may look to sell treasury bills and bonds to purchase higher yield corporate bonds and stocks, something that can help boost the stock market and improve capital market conditions, again making it easier to borrow money. So that's why central banks might pursue QE. But what we've described isn't much different from the standard open market operations carried out by central banks. In fact, purchasing treasury bills is one of the standard mechanisms used by the Federal Reserve for managing the federal funds rate in the US. What makes QE different is its scale and the fact that it can span other financial assets outside of government debt. In the US, for example, the Federal Reserve found itself adding almost $4 trillion to the US economy after 2008. And from 2009 to 2010, the central bank bought just over $1 trillion worth of mortgage-backed securities, an investment that became unpopular and risky due to its exposure to the housing market. This not only helped boost money supply, but it unloaded unwatched assets from the banks, with the hope that it would improve confidence in the housing market and allow banks to continue providing mortgages to home buyers. Sounds like a pretty solid win-win, right? An institution that can print money.
Oh, that's super scummy. That super hits home on the capitalism for... It's capitalism for the for the customers, or it's capitalism for the citizens, and it's socialism for the for the corporations, because it's a privatized gain and it's a subsidized loss, right? Okay.
Money buys assets investors don't want to boost the economy. What could go wrong? Well, as with most things in economics, the action is not without its own risks and downsides. For one, QE can lead to runaway inflation. Inflation is when the value of a currency falls. With more money in circulation, each dollar becomes less valuable, leading to rising prices. QE will most of the time cause inflation, and while most developed countries target a low single-digit inflation rate, they may accidentally push inflation much higher, potentially causing a crisis when QE is implemented. Secondly, injecting money into the economy may not necessarily lead to higher business activity. After all, the central bank can't force banks and businesses to use their newfound liquidity. And if institutions don't have confidence in the stability of the...
Why are you running from debating Avi on his Trump vote? I think that there's like a cost, there's a price that you have to pay with your sanity when you debate Trump voters. And I haven't even tried. I haven't even tried to imagine how absolutely fucking retarded the arguments Avi is going to use to justify that vote. It's going to be like, well, I don't really care about all the other stuff, and I don't think Trump will actually be that bad, and the state of Israel is really important to me. It's going to be like the most retarded combination of things like that, and I'm going to want to off myself.
Economy, they may simply hoard their newfound cash. This is part of the reason why Japan has continued to experience deflation, even after implementing QE programs and boosting money supply quite a bit. And even US banks were found to have held quite a bit of the money they were...
Also, like, I've worked so hard to kind of like build my audience and kind of push us more like center left or even progressive in some ways, and that conversation might actually turn me into a fucking Nazi. So I gotta be careful, all right? I gotta be responsible for my brain.
To experience deflation, even after implementing QE programs and boosting money supply quite a bit. And even US banks were found to have held quite a bit of the money they received from the post-2008 program rather than lending it out. Finally, QE programs are not intended to be permanent. Once the economy has recovered, gotten back on its feet, and inflation starts to rise, the central bank will often reverse its QE program, selling assets back into the market, shrinking or unwinding its balance sheet, and sterilizing or destroying money it receives to reduce money supply and keep inflation in check, effectively putting money back to the alternate portal it pulled it from. But the timing of this step is just as important as the decision of implementing QE. If done at the wrong time, it can make a bad situation much worse, taking away a crutch businesses and banks have come to rely on. Now, QE is thought to have helped quite a bit with the post-2008 recovery of countries around the world, according to institutions like the IMF. But we have yet to see countries fully reverse the programs they put in place. The US Federal Reserve's balance sheet still has roughly $4 trillion worth of assets, up from around $1 trillion in 2008. So while the process can support a country and bring cash to businesses in need, it requires extreme caution and care if a country wishes to maintain confidence in its economy and, importantly, its currency. Thanks for watching. If you like this video, make sure to hit the like button. If you like what we're doing here, make sure to subscribe. Hit the bell icon if you want notifications about future videos. If you have any feedback or topics you want me to cover in a future video, leave a comment down below. For the Plain Bagel, my name is Richard Coffin. Thanks for joining me today.
Thanks.
Have you heard of Skillshare? Well, they're the sponsor of today's video, and I think you should check them out. Why? Well, it's a website that offers thousands of classes teaching you different...
Okay, sorry, we're back.
Was being used.
Exactly. Why would Trump installing a loyalist as the Fed chair be bad enough to justify a coup? Wouldn't it just be another case of Republicans mismanaging the economy? So imagine you have a retarded mom and dad and grandma and grandpa, and you work at Google, okay? And imagine that they have a computer inside one of the offices. And your mom and dad says, I'm gonna fucking destroy Google, okay? And you see them run into the office and they get on the computer. You don't really care that much. They have an ordinary user account. All the permissions are set up correctly. They, like, what are they gonna do, okay? So they run inside and they get on the computer and they try to log into google.com and they try to kill everything, but like everyone just kind of laughs at them and they're like, okay, well, you're kind of retarded. There are a few people at Google who kind of get nervous because they're like, I don't know why there's this crazy dude in the office trying to destroy our company, but he can't really do anything, okay? That's Trump term 1. Trump term 2 has been Trump going back and saying, I'm going to destroy Google. And also, I'm now best friends with all of the people that run the admin permissions department or whatever the fuck that dole out permissions for computer systems. Now this is a lot more scary because now all the other Google employees are having their shit randomly deleted, databases of information are getting dumped or destroyed, and now there's like significant damage to the company being caused because now this person has the necessary friends and realize, okay, well, I can't just do it from an ordinary computer. I need permissions to fuck the whole company up, okay? And this is like the first 100 days so far of this term. That person now saying, I really want to destroy Google, and somebody comes by with the password to like the local utilities company and enables them to basically turn the electricity off with the push of a button. That's the equivalent of Donald Trump installing a new chair on the Federal Reserve. It's just another layer of stuff that we shouldn't have to worry about being politically captive, that the monetary supply might now be a tool that Trump is going to use to do whatever the fuck. Like that's another thing that he shouldn't have, like he's already fucked up every single thing he's put his disgusting grubby orange fingers on, okay? That he's had way more ability to do than he did before because he's got more loyalists. Him being able to fuck with the money supply as well on the Federal Reserve, it would be I say it would be an apocalypse, a financial apocalypse. We're already kind of in a financial apocalypse. It would be an even worse financial apocalypse. Like, I want to say, like, I want to be careful because, so Metalite is saying there's no real good analogy for the independence of the Fed relative to the last 100 years of monetary policy. If it happened, you would need to go to a previous empire and see when they fucked with the monetary supply and created mass destruction. So Metalite is kind of right in that this would just be like an unbelievably crazy thing. But we're already there, okay? I don't want to be really careful not to normalize where we are. We're already past, like, 10% tariffs on the entire fucking world is already fucking crazy. And we kind of all just accepted that now because at least it's not 90% tariffs on all the rest of the world. But like, it would just be insane for him to be able to get a loyalist in the Federal Reserve. It would just be so bad. It would be so bad. It would be so bad.
To stimulate markets in the lead up to the election. Besant claimed that he would reverse this, but has instead doubled down, doing it on a larger scale than before. Under Janet Yellen,
should Congress be allowed to create independent branches of the government like the Fed? Isn't it the president's job to implement the laws Congress creates? Yeah, but I mean, per the Constitution, Congress is allowed to create offices and dictate how those things go. That's like that's a core constitutional thing. Like,
down, doing it on a larger scale than before. Under Janet Yellen, the maturity profile of treasuries was still within the normal range. Besant now says that he will keep the dollar quantity of long-term treasuries steady, which sounds fine, but because the budget deficit is growing, this means he's issuing proportionately fewer long-term bonds. What Besant is doing is essentially a bet that long-term interest rates will fall. If he expected them to rise, he would want to lock in today's low rates right now by issuing long-term bonds. Instead, he's borrowing short-term, which means that he constantly has to refinance. And if rates go up...
How does he appoint a loyalist to the Fed chair? I thought it was just a member of the board. I think technically the president has the right to do this. They just usually don't fuck with it. They'll usually just reappoint the same one or something. Have we accepted it because it's Trump or because it went from 90% to 10%? I feel like it's more of the former because it was no surprise he would do any of this. No, it was a surprise because most of the world, even the financial and economic world, was not very politically in tune, which is fair because like politics kind of has a band that it runs, like like a what do you call a band, like of probabilities where you have like a tail for your data. There's like a range of things that can politically happen, and I don't think financial markets or economies generally consider things that are way outside the norm, that are kind of like wacky and kooky and crazy. And I don't even necessarily blame them because most of the time this stuff just wouldn't happen. I don't think the world markets were legitimately considering that Donald Trump, that the United States of America might self-destruct and destroy its position as the world leader in the economy, in the global markets. I don't think anybody really thought that would happen. I don't think, even though Trump said it a billion times, and maybe politically you could have made that prediction, financially there's a whole bunch of reasons why this should never really happen. And I don't think people consider that much, but I don't know. We'll see.
He'll be
we can read this real quick because I've seen this article come up a few times. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent and Commerce Secretary Howard Nutlick got Donald Trump alone and away from rival advisor Peter Navarro to convince him to put a 90-day pause on most tariffs, according to a report. The president's financial team has taken hits over the administration's first 100 days, with many wondering if Nutlick should represent the administration on television. Perhaps no one has been more controversial than Navarro, however, particularly stoking the ire of... Perhaps no one has been more controversial than Navarro, however, particularly stoking the ire of first buddy Elon Musk, who is feuded with a man he's called dumber than a sack of bricks and truly a moron. Trump eased the tanking global stock market by issuing a 90-day tariff pause, which maintained severe levies on Chinese goods but dropped Liberation Day tariffs for many allies. That's not true. It didn't drop them. It just dropped them to 10%. Careful. A new report by Wall Street Journal suggests Bessent and Lutnick saw Navarro as the biggest obstacle to stopping the tariffs. DailyMail.com has already reported that Trump consulted with the two before implementing the pause. The morning of April 9th, 1 week before Liberation Day, Bessent and Lutnick reportedly waited for Navarro to be in a meeting and hightailed it for the Oval Office to get Trump isolated for an unscheduled meeting. Navarro? Sorry. Bessent and Nutlick convinced Trump he needed to hit pause on the tariffs and even stood watching as he typed out the announcement on his Truth Social platform. Navarro was reportedly stunned by the tariff reversal. Caroline Leavitt and Bessent then immediately went out and made the announcement to shock reporters before Navarro could even get to Trump. Navarro. Oh, it's Navarro. You meant to put an accent. Navarro. Navarro. Navarro? Navarro. Could even get to Trump with an anonymous source claiming they needed everyone signing or singing from the same song sheet. Did you listen to the New York Times interview with Navarro? No. As the reporters moved into the Oval, Navarro was walking down the south lawn to do a TV appearance at one of the many cameras set up on the lawn. He turned around and went back inside instead of going on air. Trump came out publicly with an announcement of his own that afternoon, claiming the markets were getting yippy even after he'd warned people to stay cool that very morning. Everyone involved has largely denied this account of the story, in particular Navarro. More mischief from anonymous sources seeking to divide and conquer the trade team, he told Wall Street Journal. Wait, what was this interview? Or when did this happen? I really believe most people are unaware that all imports are at 10% and will only realize when prices of everything start to go up. The news are making an awful job at informing people. I think, but the issue is that, I'm sorry, the problem is that it's hard to know how bad the economy really was versus how much people were just told it was bad and then believed it because of that. And so if it is the case that people were being fed propaganda by the administration, and that's why they believe, or by the Republicans, I guess, because they weren't the administration, and that's why they believe the economy was bad, then it stands to reason that if the economy inflates a little bit, they can still kind of, you know, ward some of that discomfort off by saying that the economy is not doing bad, if that makes sense. So I guess we're going to find out how much is real versus how much is false when it comes to people's feelings on inflation and the economy and everything. So the Fed chair still requires Senate confirmation, so there's at least a tiny hypothetical safeguard still. I have no faith in the Republicans, so I don't even know why you would bring that up, but I salute you, sir.
Refinancing at higher and higher interest rates. The rapid U-turns in US trade policy are destroying both consumer and business confidence, to the extent that analysts are now slashing their growth estimates and worried that the trade chaos will trigger a recession.
Wait, when do we get the finalized like Q1 GDP growth numbers or contraction numbers?
If the new trade policies cause inflation and reduce growth, which is reasonable to expect, the Federal Reserve will find itself in a very tricky position. The Fed is already expecting something like stagflation from the current economic policies. If that happens, Powell, or whoever replaces him at the Fed, will have to choose between the Federal Reserve's employment and price stability mandates. The US government already runs a budget deficit of 7% of GDP, which is quite high for a healthy economy. In its quest to renew and extend the tax cuts from Trump's first term, Congress has agreed to borrow even more. The amount the US spends on interest on its debt has exploded over the last 5 years, meaning that higher bond yields would cause big problems.
I love Tom Bilyeu, okay? And I'm not going to be mean or say anything mean about him, okay? Because I appreciate him. I appreciate that he talks to me and he responds to me. But man, one of the things that's very frustrating that I feel like I said over and over again to a lot of different people, especially Tom, was if you care about things, because Tom said this, and I think all the other crypto guys were saying this. I don't know if Tom's a crypto guy. All of these people said that they cared about the interest, the budget deficits, and the debt, that it was like the biggest crime in the world is that we were passing the debt on to our children or some bullshit like that. They all said this. And my response to all of these people was always, if that's what you care about, isn't Donald Trump a horrible pick? Because didn't he mismanage the budget for his first 4 years in office? He did, by the way. He ran the highest budget deficit in the world prior to COVID. It wasn't just COVID, it was prior to that. The reason why was because of the tax cuts. When you reduce your income, you have to make up for it in some way, and he made up for it by borrowing. So if the budget deficit is the thing you care about, I don't know why Donald Trump is your guy. It doesn't make any sense. It literally does not make any sense. And I said this a million times. And are we, Are we really going to reduce the debt? Absolutely not, right? Because that would require a budget surplus. Are we even going to reduce our budget deficit? I'm not actually sure on that. I don't know where we're at right now on that. Is a deficit meaning the amount that we have to borrow every year to fund the government? Is the borrowing amount going to go down, or is that going to be higher? Because if so, what the fuck are we doing? All of this pain and agony for nothing? All of Doge for nothing? All that talk of responsible spending, the economy that he inherited from Biden, the markets that were increasing, the manufacturing that was exploding, America's second best manufacturer in the world, the best recovered economy from all of fucking COVID. He got that from Biden. My number one fear for the second Trump admin was that Trump was going to come in, do nothing, and take credit for everything that Biden had done. He could have just sat back and said, look at all these investments in our economy, not mentioning it's from the CHIPS Act, it's from the Inflation Reduction Act, it's from the infrastructure bill. Like, all of these things could have passed, and Trump could have just sat back and taken credit for them. And he just pushes the self-destruct button over and over and over and over and over again.
Yield on long-term bonds essentially tells the administration whether they can spend or not. Earlier this month, the House of Representatives approved the Senate's plan for a budget that could add $5.8 trillion to deficits over the next 10 years, according to the Nonpartisan Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget. That's more, they point out, than Trump's...
Are we really blaming a single person or looking at the system as a whole? We're blaming a single person. We're blaming a single person. When you want to be a dictator, you're going to be held accountable as a dictator. Donald Trump rules like a king. And at the end of the day, the king's decisions are the king's decisions. You can't blame some other person for them. That's why you're the king.
First-term tax cuts, the response to the COVID-19 pandemic, and Biden's stimulus and infrastructure bills combined. The US is already spending half of its budget on interest rate expenses alone. Elon Musk's Doge has failed to make any significant cuts to government spending, despite causing huge disruption. A tax cut, combined with lower growth, could spook the bond market, as in such a scenario, you would see debt growing faster than GDP, with no special event to explain it, like the global financial crisis or COVID.
And that's the thing that's frustrating too. And I blame journalists. Journalists are part of the problem. It is part of you guys, part of the journalist class or whatever in the mainstream media now. I would say alternative media too, but I literally don't. Alternative media, I don't even treat them as real human beings because they're so fucking disgusting. How was it that so much conversation could happen around all the inflation in Biden's term? Look at all this inflation from Biden. How many times did that topic come up? And all of us were looking around and it's like, what do you think caused that inflation? It was Biden spending. It was the Democrats. Hello? A little bit more there? It was bad Democratic policies. And anything else? It was printing money. Anything else? I don't know. Donald Trump really fucked his that was COVID. There was COVID. It doesn't count. You can't talk about the last year of Trump. We only talk about the first 3 years. It was COVID. It's like, oh, okay, all right. Oh, my bad. Anytime you try to talk about how fucked the last year of Donald Trump was, COVID is wheeled out immediately, unless you talk about immigration. They're like, Donald Trump's immigration numbers on year 4 were amazing. Why is that? Well, it's a little thing called border security. What about Title 42 and COVID? What? Don't know about that. What about his stock market? Hello, COVID was destroying the world, except not at the border. What border? You mean the one that Trump kept secure with his bare fucking, like, it's so crazy. Because comparing Biden's economy or comparing the inflation in the early 2020s over whatever the fuck is happening now is such bullshit, because there was a global pandemic that was largely to explain the monetary policy and all of the decisions that followed. And to have that conversation of inflation during Biden's term without bringing up COVID is just insanity. It's insane. It's insane. Trump added more to the debt than Biden did, and Biden had more stimulus spending, I believe, for COVID than Trump did, because Trump did the huge fucking tax cuts and spent so much goddamn money. Okay.
With no special event to explain it, like the global financial crisis or COVID. In such a scenario, investors could stop buying government bonds and interest rates would rise. Much like with Liz Truss's mini-budget disaster a few years ago. The bond market might not behave for the US administration, making America's fiscal profligacy much more difficult to maintain. If interest rates were to rise rapidly...
Oh yeah, this... Like... Oh. Never forget the party that forced you to shut down your businesses, let your elderly relatives die alone, forced your kids into remote learning and masks, and pushed you into a vaccine to be able to eat indoors or go to work. Or go to work. Now they demand extra due process for an alleged gangbanger, wife beater, illegal alien. Your rights didn't matter, but his do. Hello? Hello? What happened? How did we all forget who the president was over COVID? How is this possible? How does nobody remember who the president was? Hello? Donald Trump warp sped out the fucking... He's the one that fucking got the vaccine in record fucking time. What are you talking about? Holy shit. How do you respond to the COVID state policy argument? What do you mean? I thought if you want to say, and by the way, if you wanted to be intellectually honest, it is true that it was the states that had large decisions here. However, if you want to be intellectually honest, then you have to admit fully that your the destruction of the Department of Education was completely and totally fucking bullshit. Because I thought that we took apart the Department of Education to give educations back to the states. Wasn't that the reason? But if the states all shut down their schools over COVID, well, what the fuck was going on there? Wasn't that Trump's Department of Education? Or are you going to tell me that states had full autonomy over their education while the Department of Education existed under Trump, but somehow they lost it when Trump came in for a second term? It doesn't work. It's all bullshit. It's not internally consistent. Forget what the actual facts are. It's not even internally consistent by their own logic. If states had so much autonomy they could shut down their fucking schools under the Department of Education with Donald Trump, then why do we ever have to get rid of it? It sounds like states had full autonomy over their education, which they always have. Okay.
Rapidly as investors backed away from buying US treasuries, Besant's decision to lean more on short-term treasuries to fund the government could turn out to be a huge mistake. We're already seeing real-world problems associated with Trump's tariffs. The Dallas Fed's energy survey showed a small increase in activity in the oil and gas sector for the first quarter of 2025. But with oil prices down and the cost of drilling up, this doesn't work for the oil and gas sector. Tariffs on steel have pushed up the cost of new wells by 10 or 20%, according to some estimates. We've already seen a collapse in ocean container bookings since the tariff announcements. The lack of container...
Yeah, but what about the truth besides hypocrisy? Was it more Democrat state policy fault or Donald Trump's? The first grade truth is the states have the absolute end right to say what they want. The actual truth is a bit more complicated. States ultimately could dictate what they wanted, but the federal government provided guidance. And I believe that it literally was the federal government that, oh, fuck, am I making this up? It was so long ago. Didn't the federal government, was it the NIH, Fauci, literally publish guidelines for opening and closing schools that it issued? It just gave guidelines to all those states for how they wanted to open and close and what the recommendations were. If Donald Trump had any fucking idea what he was doing, Donald Trump could have led a coordinated effort between the states to do things in a coordinated manner. But the reality is nobody knew how bad COVID was going to get. Now, retrospectively, we look at it and we go, wow, shutting schools down, that was fucking retarded. And by the way, there's a strong argument that prospectively, back at the time, we probably should have kept schools open, or at the very least, we should have closed them for as long as we did. I think there are legitimate arguments at the time. But now people want to look back, you know, and do this, what is it, Monday morning quarterbacking. What do you call it? I don't know what football is, Sunday. And want to be like, oh, well, we shouldn't have never shut down anything. We should just let the economy run and it would have been fine and blah, blah, blah. It's like, maybe, but we didn't know at the time. We didn't know how bad COVID was going to get. No one had any fucking idea. So states did what they felt like they had to shut down schools. There could have been more guidance from the federal government, but Trump was floundering. He'd already fucking lied over and over and over again about how many cases of COVID were in the United States. So nobody had any fucking idea what to do. Every individual state was basically acting on their own.
Or 20%, according to some estimates. We've already seen a collapse in ocean container bookings since the tariff announcements. The lack of containers arriving at US ports is hitting the trucking industry too, not unlike the way it hit British truckers in the wake of Brexit. Mack Trucks announced this Thursday that they...
Oh, and Brits do this too. Bongers do this as well. I think Murray, was falling into this, where suspiciously, every time people talk about the struggling British economy, nobody seems to bring up Brexit. I feel like I don't hear it ever being spoken about from conservatives, which is so crazy because Brexit was supposed to be this great savior for the United Kingdom. And now it seems like the UK economy basically got kicked in the fucking nuts and nobody wants to say anything about it. It's kind of weird, huh?
They plan to lay off as much as 10% of their workforce in Allentown, Pennsylvania over the next 3 months. Their spokesperson told the press that heavy-duty truck orders continue to be negatively affected by market uncertainty about freight rates, demand, possible regulatory changes, and the impact of tariffs. Most of the big Trump trades that investors placed when the election results were announced are now failing and being unwound. Investors had bet on a strong dollar and a weak euro. They'd bet on cryptocurrencies pushing the price of Bitcoin above $100,000 after the election results were announced.
To be fair, I think most Brexiters understood the cost. It wasn't an economy issue, but a sovereignty issue. Bullshit. 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 And cope. And bullshit. And cope. Okay? They'll say it was a sovereignty issue, but the sovereignty had to do with things that would have controlled aspects of their economy, okay? Part of the reason why was because they felt like they had no control over whatever the European Union was saying, which is bullshit, which is not true, which is fucking retarded, okay? Half the fucking bonger dipshits didn't even fucking know how to vote for European Parliament members, okay? I literally had debates with people who didn't even know that they voted on these things. Sargon of Akkad, one of them. And two, it was sold to the bonger people. It was sold as though it was going to be economically beneficial, not economically ruinous, okay? I'm not saying you're a liar in particular, but it was not sold as though we're going to have to take a huge hit to our economy, but it's going to be worth it for our sovereignty. It was sold by Nigel Farage driving around on that stupid fucking bus saying, think of all the money we're going to save. Think of how amazing it's going to be when all this money is going right to the NIH instead of being sent to Brussels, those evil Brussels sprouts.
They expected
finally we're going to be able to fish real fish again and not have weird bananas or something.
Above and a weak euro. They'd bet on cryptocurrencies pushing the price of Bitcoin above $100,000 after the election results were announced. They expected emerging markets to underperform and big American tech firms to outperform. None of this has worked out as planned. A lot of people have been asking if China holds any cards in fighting back against Trump's tariffs. And of course they do. That's where cards are made, after all. The United States is in a stronger bargaining position than China is, as the US is the biggest market for China's manufactured goods. One problem, though, is that the United States can't actually source many of the goods it buys from China internally or from anywhere else. China, on the other hand, can replace its imports.
Oh shit, true. All these guys were singing a different tune during COVID. This is Bill Ackman. Bill Ackman is one of the probably the leading cause of Trump cum deficiency in the planet, because this guy consumes so much for himself without sharing with any of the other Trump sycophants. Him and David Sachs, okay, they eat all of it themselves. It's bullshit.
Last week, you advised President Trump to have a 30-day shutdown. You said you were speaking with the CEOs of portfolio companies, that hell is coming. How do you feel we're performing right now? Has there been a market improvement since the president and some new state governors did start to take some measures?
Yes, at the time I made my remarks, none of the states were in a shelter-in-place mode. In the beginning, the following day, that night, California, then New York, then Nevada, Ohio, Delaware, probably a dozen or more states. And I think it helps make the case.
What's the day for this interview? March 23rd, 2020.
Case I was trying to make, which is it's great that New York State has adopted this, these policies to reduce the risk of infection, because unfortunately, New York City hospitals are overwhelmed, and when hospitals get overwhelmed, people can die, and more people, some percentage will die from coronavirus. Some will die from just not being able to access an ICU bed because they had a stroke or otherwise. So it's an important step for New York. But the problem is you can't do this one state at a time. It's one of our weaknesses as a country of 50 states. It's where the federal government needs to get involved and really basically do a shutdown nationwide. And we do it for, I sort of pick a 30 days, sort of 2 weeks of incubation, if you will, plus a cushion. The country doesn't get shut down in its entirety. Of course, you keep all essential businesses, infrastructure, government, pharma, food production, agriculture, all the things that you see in the kind of New York State and Ohio and other protocols. But you do it once. You do it for the whole country, and you set the clock, and you tell businesses we're going to reopen the country in 30 days. And the other thing you do is you massively accelerate testing. And one opportunity we have not yet exploited that's being exploited.
Like, all of these conservatives will go back and say COVID was no big deal. It was whatever. Nobody cares. But at the time, they were saying, like, Cuomo literally murdered hundreds or thousands of old people by putting a single sick person in an old person's home and condemning all of them to certain death. Whatever.
From the US more force many of the goods it buys from China internally or from anywhere else. China, on the other hand, can replace its imports from the US more easily, as China mostly buys agricultural produce from the United States. So a big winner from this trade war will be Brazil, who were a big winner in 2019 too, when the first round of tariffs was announced. Brazilian farmers, according to Reuters, are already seeing additional Chinese demand for soybeans. There's been a lot of press about how the US is reliant on China for rare earth metals, which we're always told are crucial for building missiles, fighter jets, and other high-tech products. While that's true, Javier Blas at Bloomberg points out that the United States only imports around $170 million a year worth of rare earth metals, and the majority of them are used in things like motors in power tools and vacuum cleaners. Many of the companies who need these metals have already stockpiled them, and even if the United States had to pay up for them, it wouldn't be a major expense. So, will China blink first in this trade war? Well, once again, that's hard to answer, as it's not really clear what China could even offer Trump in order to satisfy him. Trump, for all we know, may have no desire to negotiate anything with China and may just want the tax revenues associated with the tariffs. It is possible that he believes that this will bring in enough revenue to balance his budget. There are rumors, too, that President Xi has no plans to meet up with Trump in person to negotiate at all, as after seeing the spectacle of Ukraine's Zelensky being publicly humiliated in front of the world press and being given fashion advice by Marjorie Taylor Greene's boyfriend, political analysts are saying that there's no way that he would agree to any American-led publicity stunts designed to humiliate China. There hasn't been much press about Biden's Inflation Reduction Act of 2022, which authorized $800 billion in renewable energy and climate change spending, which is now projected to cost more than $1 trillion over the next 10 years and possibly between $2 and $4 trillion by 2050. People argue that Trump won't repeal the act because so many jobs in renewables are expected to be created in Republican-led states like Oklahoma, Arkansas, and Mississippi. However, this week the Trump administration issued an order for the leading global energy company Equinor to stop construction at its northeastern U.S. offshore wind project. This project involved hundreds of millions of dollars of payments by Equinor to the U.S. federal government for the Bureau of Ocean and Energy Management, Ocean Land License, and Equinor had reached financial close on the project and had drawn down over $1.5 billion of its project loans to finance construction works to date. Bankers described the stop construction order midway through this project as having a chilling effect for international investors, given the rarity of administrations retroactively cancelling permitted and approved and in-construction projects.
Is this Because I heard this, but I've never done much reading on it. Were they actually canceling? Did they actually start canceling projects that had already been approved under Biden? I guess that was part of the big deal with the USAID stuff, is that part of the reason why those lawsuits are being brought up is because the government was literally canceling contracts that had already been agreed upon. Like there was already money promised to people, some for the work that had already been finished, like the work had been done, and the government was saying, no, we're not going to pay this out now.
Stop work order on a multi-billion-dollar international investment project like this implies that the Trump administration is quite likely to repeal all of the IRA tax subsidies for renewable projects. Cancelling these projects will save far more money than Doge could, and Trump's base is not on side for green transition projects. The investment case for projects like these only works with large government-provided cash tax subsidies. There are many ways that this could work. Trump could keep the subsidies in place and disallow any usage or distribution of them. A complete repeal might be politically difficult, but Trump appears to have complete control over all branches of government, so who knows? He could even keep the subsidies in place and allow their use only for nuclear and fossil fuel projects. Predicting Trump's economic policies has been impossible so far, as they appear to change on a day-by-day basis.
Or hour by hour.
But this seems like something that he would love to cut. There's been a certain amount of talk recently about how the Trump administration could radically restructure and refinance US debt under what's being called the Mar-a-Lago Accord. This phrase was first coined by Zoltan Pozsar, the former Credit Suisse strategist, last year. He put forth that the US could force countries to accept a weaker dollar and lower interest rates on their US Treasury investments in exchange for protection under the US security umbrella. The idea has been described as a protection racket by Martin Wolf. The name Mar-a-Lago Accord is a take on the Plaza Accord, a 1985 deal where France, Japan, West Germany and the UK agreed to work with the US to jointly weaken the dollar against their currencies. Pozsar's idea was elaborated on by Stephen Moran, the chairman of Trump's Council of Economic Advisors, in a paper which provides a sort of intellectual framework for a lot of what Trump is currently doing with his trade policies. The idea being discussed...
I think that's the one thing that's like 3 people in my chat that have been obsessively linking this. Like, read this, read this, read this, read this. I think that's that thing.
...be to force investors to accept an...
You say that Trump is one of the worst presidents the U.S. had? On my limited reading of U.S. history, easily the worst president in U.S. history, for sure. What, like, bar none. Save for... Who was the president of the Confederacy? I have no idea. Did they elect a president? They must have had somebody, right? Maybe that guy is worse.
Intellectual framework for a lot of what Trump is currently doing with his trade policies. The idea being discussed would be to force investors to accept an extension on the maturity of their Treasury holdings at a below-market interest rate. This is obviously something no investor would want to accept, and most would consider a default. There was a very interesting discussion on this topic on the Odd Lots podcast this Thursday, but the fact that people are seriously discussing a default by the US government on its bond obligations is extremely disturbing and tells you a lot about why investors might be worried about investing in Trump's America. To be very clear, Trump himself has never mentioned a Mar-a-Lago Accord or discussed anything remotely similar to this idea. Instead, he's focused entirely on tariffs. I don't believe that such a deal is even remotely likely, and I think that even attempting to implement a policy like this would be so destructive and chaotic for the US economy and financial markets that it could never happen. As Martin Wolf asked in the FT, why would any investor believe that Trump is capable of sticking to any deal he has reached? He has, after all, abandoned Ukraine, put the commitment to
Jackson was pretty cringe for giving us the president of ignoring the Supreme Court on the way that he did. Honestly, I just don't know enough about that time period to be able to say. I wouldn't be able to say. I don't know. Keep in mind the institution of the Supreme Court and everything was a lot newer back then too, so we didn't have the same precedence and strength of Supreme Court rulings and all that. But I mean, not to excuse it. I mean,
NATO into doubt and mounted an assault on Canada. I'm not as negative on investing in the United States as many of the people I've quoted in this video, mostly because I believe that there are sufficient checks and balances in the American form of government to prevent any of the worst case scenarios that people have been worrying about from actually happening. While the US has lost some credibility as market-moving policies are announced and withdrawn in quick succession, all at a time where high deficits and lingering inflation worries mean that there's little room for mistakes. So far, the market moves have not been too extreme. The US economy is still strong, and Trump does appear to respond to market chaos by backing down, which
Treasury to yields, right?
Is a good sign for investors. The problems that we've been talking about are all just policy mistakes, which fortunately can be reversed. They're not structural, and they're very different to the situations faced by the economy during the global financial crisis or during the pandemic. I do worry that a lot of retail investors have been conditioned to always buy the first market downtick in the belief that not only do stonks always go up, but that they recover from problems at great speed. Markets haven't yet priced in 3 years and 3/4 more of chaos, and investors aren't really pricing in the damage that could be done to great American companies like Apple if the president continues on his current path.
Like, I'm sorry, hold on. 1 second. There are so many conservatives who are like, we need to turn down the temperature, guys. You need to be more civil. Why is the left being so unhinged? Happy Easter to all, including the radical left lunatics who are fighting and scheming so hard to bring murderers, drug lords, dangerous prisoners, and the mentally insane and well-known MS-13 gang members and wife beaters back into our country. Happy Easter also to the weak and ineffective judges and law enforcement officials who are allowing this sinister attack on our nation to continue, an attack so violent that it will never be forgotten. Sleepy Joe Biden purposefully allowed millions of criminals to enter our country, totally unvetted and unchecked through an open borders policy that will go down in history as the single most calamitous act ever perpetuated upon America. He was by far our worst and most incompetent president, a man who had absolutely no idea what he was doing. But to him, and to the person that ran and manipulated the auto pen, perhaps our real president, and to all the people who cheated in the 2020 presidential election in order to get this highly destructive moron elected, I wish you with great love, sincerity, and affection a very happy Easter from Trump, Truth Social, 4/20/25, 8:46 a.m. Don't ever take these people seriously. Don't take the Asmongold seriously. Don't do it. When they say shit about how important it is to be nice and how you're hurting your side when you're not being so, don't ever take them seriously. Okay? Don't ever take them seriously. Don't ever take them seriously.
The United States is a country rich in resources with an educated workforce and an entrepreneurial spirit that should not be bet against. I think that it's a mistake to want manufacturing jobs back from China. While trade is out of balance, the goal should be to sell the goods that America is best at making internationally.
Not reduce your inflow of goods.
Not to take one of the most productive workforces in the world
and make them
give
less
them the
productive.
Jobs done.
Yes. Yes. Why am I? Obviously. This is obvious. It's not even like. Don't even give me credit for saying this, because it's just obvious.
The 99th most productive workforce in the world. In an agrarian economy, it would be extremely difficult for one farmer with no access to machinery to be a whole lot more productive than his neighbour. With the high-tech businesses that America has focused on, it's possible for one worker to produce digital goods and services that can be sold all...
Digitals, that's not real. Those aren't real, though. Digital stuff is not real. Digital stuff, that's not real, by the way. Digital, guys, digital things aren't real. That's not real, by the way. We need Mike Rowe. Mike Rowe is going to come out here, and he's going to help us get real jobs.
All over the world, generating much higher productivity, which is far beyond what can be done by hand.
Are we really that productive? Because holy fuck, bro, I'm lazy as fuck. Yes, the United States produces some of the most expensive goods and services in the world. Our workforce is ultra productive. Yes.
Assembling mobile phones and toasters. It would be a huge mistake for America to destroy this type of business in order to bring back a type of work that's low margin, badly paid, and often dangerous, especially when there's no job shortage in America and we have an aging population who are more likely to be spending on services like healthcare in the coming years than on manufactured goods. At the margin, investors may be less excited about owning US assets than they were in the past, and for good reason. It's worth remembering, though, that the country still hosts many of the best run and most profitable businesses that have ever existed in human history. In the long run, its workforce, its financial system, and its infrastructure are so good that it can overcome any setbacks.
Hopefully.
If middle class and working class Americans have a problem, it's that home prices have gone up faster than wages have. And I don't see how reducing the purchasing power of the dollar or taxing imported goods will do anything to improve that situation. If you found today's...
Explain productivity. Productivity is for every hour of labor from a worker, how much revenue basically do they produce for a company? Like how much can you produce? How many dollars worth of things can you produce for an hour of labor? And the US workforce is one of the most productive in the world. Because we're highly educated, and because our economy is highly developed, a developed economy, not a resource extraction economy.
Today's video interesting, you should watch my video on the frozen real estate market next. Don't forget to check out our sponsor, Cove Pure, using the link in the description below. Talk to you in the next video. Bye.
Bye. The other problem is our wages haven't kept up with that productivity output. I don't think I agree with that. Actually, I don't agree with that. I just think that's a total bullshit myth that's been fabricated by whatever retards on the internet. I would say I need to look into it more, but every time I look into this, it's the same thing. There's one graph that gets cited showing that like wages haven't kept up with productivity. And I don't remember exactly even where this comes from, but if you read the captioning on the graph, it literally says that this graph is excluding like the 25% of jobs in order to explain the productivity gap. It's fucking retarded. Everybody is like based it on this idea, and it's supposed to be evident of how fucked everything is. And I don't know. Do you think this is true?
I think you're looking at a culture in which hobbies have disappeared.
Sure.
Like, what do people do?
Oh, yeah, it's this one. This guy right here. This is cutting. It's cutting like 25% of jobs out of this in order to get this graph. But I don't remember why. I don't even know why I don't remember what their rationale was for excluding it. But it ends up cutting like a fuck ton of tech jobs and everything, which is where a lot of the productivity gains have gone. But everybody cites this to show that our real wages haven't increased at all, and it's bullshit. It's not a myth. Our minimum wage hasn't increased in decades. Our minimum wage has nothing to do with with wages to what people get paid or whatever. Holy shit. One second. Okay, what is this real quick?
Looking at a culture in which hobbies have disappeared.
Sure.
Like, what do people do?
They
It
spend it
used
on
to
their
be
phone.
like they spend it on their phone, raging on Twitter or getting pilled on 4chan or whatever.
Why would those 75% of jobs stagnate like that? They're not stagnating. The problem is that it's looking at productivity gains across the entire market, and then it's comparing them to the wages of just a certain sector of workers, real wages of goods producing workers. Did it cut all tech out? I'm trying to remember how they did this one. But like when it says goods producing workers, this is making me think that it's even more bad faith, that it's just including people that produce like physical things. If that's the case, these are probably some of our least productive labors or least productive sectors of our economy. So why would you take all of these productivity gains, which have largely happened in tech, and then measure the real wages of non-tech workers? This is fucking retarded. Okay.
Ever. And then I think
Stop.
you're looking at a culture in which hobbies have disappeared.
Sure.
Like, what do people do?
They
It
spend it
used
on
to
their
be
phone.
like they spend it on their phone, raging on Twitter or getting pilled on 4chan or whatever. And then
we
I
got
get
some
real
pills.
interesting conspiracy theories like, I don't know that people can afford to have a garage anymore. Do people have garages anymore where they tinker, basement workshops and stuff? I'm just really interested in this idea of hobbies disappearing.
Okay. Maybe.
Welcome to Econ 102, where economist Noah Smith and I...
Hold on.
Why or why not?
The problems with the Japanese economy, and does that mean that are you thinking particularly about them dumping treasuries or something of the sort?
Wait, is this like 30 years old?
That's exactly what she's... Yeah. Well, it's very interesting. All the questions about what so-called foreigners do with investments. Let's just assume that the Japanese or any other country decides to sell some U.S. government holdings that they have. If they sell them to U.S. corporations or citizens or anything, what do they receive in exchange? They receive U.S. dollars. What do they do with the U.S. dollars? They can't get out of the system. If they sell them to the French,
I can't tell if I just assume that you're like a dipshit conservative. When, like, people do this thing where like, well, what do you have to say about this guy? Who, like, what about what Nancy Pelosi or Warren Buffett said? And then it's like a video from 1997. And I was like, aren't they hypocrite because they said this in 97 and now they're saying this? Like, no, the economy has changed. The world has changed. Like, different things are, have different levels of importance at different times in history. I'm not going to take something that somebody said in 1995 and apply it forward in a way that, I'm going to say that they're either hypocritical or there's some deep state conspiracy to change the opinions on things. I haven't even listened to this video, though, so I might just be making too big of an assumption for what you are even like this for, but sorry.
Other country decides to sell some U.S. government holdings that they have. If they sell them to U.S. corporations or citizens or anything, what do they receive in exchange? They receive U.S. dollars. What do they do with the U.S. dollars? They can't get out of the system. If they sell them to the French, the French give them something in return. Now the French own the government securities. But really, as long as we, the United States, run a deficit, a big deficit, a trade deficit, we are accepting goods and giving something in exchange to foreigners. When they send us whatever that it may be, and on balance they send us more of that than we send over there, we give them something in exchange. We may give them an IOU, we may give them a government bond, but we may give them an investment they make in the United States. But they have to be net investors in this country as long as we're net consumers of their goods. It's a tautology. So I don't even know quite how a foreign government dumps its government bonds without getting some other type of asset in exchange that may have an effect on a different market. The one question you always want to ask in economics is, and not a bad idea elsewhere too, but is, and then what? because there's always a second side to a transaction.
Yes.
And just ask yourself, if you are a Japanese bank and you sell $1 billion worth of government bonds, U.S. government bonds, what do you receive in exchange? And what do you do with it? And if you follow that through, I don't think you'll be worried about foreign governments selling U.S. bonds. It is not a threat. Charlie?
If I owned Japan, I would want a large holding of U.S. treasuries. You're on an island nation without much in the way of national resources. I think their policy is quite...
If it cuts out 25% of the most productive jobs, that still means that for the other 75% of jobs, wages have not kept up with productivity, no? Well, you're not measuring the productivity of those other jobs. Most of the productivity gains in the United States have been in highly productive sectors of the economy. It's not where our like the lowest level jobs that you work are not the ones that are the most productive. It's all the tech jobs. I don't know how to say, not low level, but like services or whatever. Why are the tariffs different? Saying things have difference in importance, but now have tariffs change. Because when people talk about tariffs, they're not talking about typically broad sanctions on the entire fucking global market. It's not the same thing. It would be like somebody saying, I think I can cure this guy by using leeches to do bloodletting or whatever. And then you're like, no, we don't do that anymore. And it's like, okay, well, can you explain why this doctor right now is saying that, for somebody who produces too much, red blood cells, that they actually do daily blood withdrawals or weekly blood withdrawals to keep their red blood cell count low or whatever? Well, it's not the same fucking thing, bro. It's not all just withdrawing blood from a person's body, whether you're using leeches or needles, right? When you're talking about tariffs, there's a difference between like, we think that somebody might be unfair in a targeted way towards our economy, and we're going to fight back using a tariff scheme in order to do it. That's a lot different than saying 10% tariffs across the entire world to bring back widget manufacturing to the United States of America. Those are two totally different things.
Quite intelligent for Japan. I'd be very surprised if they dumped all their treasuries.
If they're a net exporter to us, so what choice do they have? I mean, think about it. If they send over more goods to us than we send to them, which has been the case, they have to get something in exchange. Now, for a while, they were taking movie studios in exchange. They were taking New York real estate in exchange. I mean, they've got a choice of assets, but they don't have a choice as to whether if they can send us more than they get from us, whether they get some investment asset in return. I mean, it's amazing to me how little discussion there is about the fact that there's two sides to an equation, but it makes for better headlines when read the other way.
Also, the guy talked about this. That was true in this video, but if everybody starts dumping USD, then things get pretty weird. Not how tariffs were used historically. They were used for revenue and were general. Yeah, but that was historically. That world sucked. Why do you want to go back? Why do people say like, well, back in the day we used to do this? Back in the day we used to drink mercury and beat the shit out of our wives, base. That was the standard thing. We had fucking slaves and Nazis, and we had massive smog and pollution in the 80s in fucking LA. Like, I don't understand what this obsession is with the old world. Like, what were these aspects of the old world that were so much better that we're like, we need to go back to that? We got to go back to the old world. Where? What part of it? Why?